Okay, I thought I would just give you quick look at the background for some of the readings you'll be looking at this for Module 3. Um, it's all tied to massive social changes and economic changes that occurred as a result of the Industrial Revolution, which began in England in the mid 1700s and spread to the new United States of America in the early 1800s, and really changed everything about how people produced goods. We now have factories. These factories are creating all kinds of other issues for people who find themselves displaced, no longer farmers coming to these factories to work. Um, Changes family structures, changes the way people, obviously the environment people had, the way they lived. Um, in these factories, especially early on, kids did a lot of the work, the menial work, and the work that actually was quite dangerous, and children were frequently injured and killed in these factories. It created these new social positions with people who became fabulously wealthy by exploiting the labor of the masses and children. And then, of course, the people who work in those factories who, although some people benefited, we do have the growth of a middle class who tended to be the professionals, overseers, lawyers, accountants, all the other jobs that were needed in these factories. But for the most part, the workers were the ones who made things happen, and they had very little, and they had very poor conditions, not just at work but at home, because they lived in tenements. There wasn't indoor plumbing, so all these issues really hurt the folks who were being squeezed by the wealthy millionaires and billionaires who owned all the factories and owned and controlled all the means of production. And so people, saw these problems and started looking for other ways of distributing the wealth that was being created by these factories, in order to bring some of that wealth and benefits of that wealth down to the people who are actually doing all the work. There's lots of different ways people have to achieve these goals. You'll read some of them. They're often all lumped together under one umbrella known as socialism, but really socialism is just this broad idea that the wealth that's created in a capitalist economy is unfairly allocated to today we would say the 1% who own all the wealth, while millions of people within the 99% suffer sometimes. And so socialism is really an umbrella term. There's different types of socialism that we don't really need to get into, but you will be reading from Eugene Debs, who's maybe America's most famous socialist ever. He ran for president many times. In one instance, he ran for president from a jail cell because he had been jailed for speaking out against the government during World War I, when this country had passed a law forbidding speaking out against the government or the war. So I think from his reading, you'll really get an idea of what he meant by socialism, which to him was just simply looking out for the people who were being exploited within the capitalist economy. And then something much more recent. This is a very famous book written in 1962 that exposed how much poverty still existed in the United States in the 60s. This was an America that was the superpower of the world, the greatest economy perhaps in the history of the world. The American post-World War II economy benefited so many people, and the middle class grew exponentially during that time. As this book exposed, even throughout all that prosperity, there were millions of people living in poverty, dire poverty, on the verge of starvation. This launched what became known as the War on Poverty, And as part of the War on Poverty, we developed food stamps program, other types of assistance to help the housing assistance, medical assistance, health care for the needy, and other ways that this all began because, in large part, this book exposed that poverty. And then you'll also read the New York City Declaration from Occupy Wall Street, which was very much a response to the economic crash that occurred 10 years ago in 2008, and the results that had upon the economy in terms of massive unemployment and a redistribution of wealth up to the 1%. So the conditions are very different from what existed during the Industrial Revolution, but the wealth inequalities that began there are actually very similar today. It's people who work hard struggle to get by, where people who, at the top of the pay scale do bring in so much more wealth as a proportion of the total wealth out there. Okay, and then finally from the Sagebrush and Slot Machines book, you have a couple of selections. One is kind of a fun look at Nevada's history, called Desert Challenge, and the other is an excerpt from the autobiography of one of Nevada and definitely Las Vegas's most famous citizen, Sammy Davis Jr., talking about what conditions were like between the races in Vegas back in the 60s and 70s when he was performing, and some of the hypocrisies that he noted between people being able to, the entertainers, the black performers, but unable to even eat in the restaurants where they were performing. So enjoy that, and welcome to Module 3.